So I'm very happy to be here today to share some of my research on economic resilience, and I'm going to be focusing on two of my papers. One that was written about 10 years ago and appeared in the Journal of Regional Science, of which Marlon is the editor, and another one that was just completed. Now, before I start my presentation, I wanted to acknowledge the contributions of two of my co-authors in this work along the way, and the co-authors of the two papers I'm going to be talking about today. One of them is Shuyi Liao, who is now an associate professor, a former grad student of mine, now an associate professor at one of the national Taiwan universities, and Elizabeth Krausman, who is a senior researcher at the European Commission Joint Research Center in Ispra. So I want to begin by pointing out something you probably know. Everywhere you turn, you see a book or an article with the title Resilience in it. And these are three examples from the middle of the last decade. The one in the middle is edited by Howard Chernick, and it's an outgrowth of a set of studies in the aftermath of 9/11. The one on the left, I'm sure we've got several planning students here. This was edited by Vail and Campanella. They're two planning professors at MIT and North Carolina, and it expanded the range of sort of disasters to be looked at to include earthquakes, floods, and war. And the one on the right is just an issue of the Federal Reserve Bulletin of Atlanta, focusing on Hurricane Katrina. So the theme here is resilience, yet, for instance, in the two edited volumes, there are 26 papers. Only one of them ever bothered to define resilience. And over on the right-hand side, there's kind of a very vague definition. Well, what's happened, interestingly, since in the last couple of years, everybody's tried to define resilience. It's gone the opposite direction. So you now have hundreds of definitions. There's also a realization that resilience is multidimensional. So there are efforts to come up with resilience indicators and compile them into a resilience index. But for reasons I'm going to talk about in a minute, this effort has pretty much been misguided. The point is that resilience gets tossed around all too often these days, and it's become a very popular buzzword. And that really undercuts its effectiveness, really turns people onto it, because it's been used to define anything you do to deal with hazards. And when something applies to everything, it really applies to nothing. So in my research the past several years, and I should have shown this slide too, not only in academic work, but you see popular press use the term resilience, and I could have given you literally hundreds of these examples. So my work has been involved in answering these key questions, the first five for many years, more recently the sixth one. So is resilience a meaningful concept? Well, the answer is yes, very much so. Can it be rigorously defined? And it can, at least in the economic realm, and I think it can in others. Can it be empirically measured? Well, we've developed an operational metric and applied it successfully for a number of years. How effective has resilience been to date? Very much so. And it is a low-cost way of reducing losses from hazards, as opposed to mitigation, which is often deals with structural aspects of the built environment and can be very expensive. Can resilience be enhanced or depleted? And the answer is yes. You can build up resilience capacity in advance of a disaster and then implement it when it's needed. And it can be depleted or overwhelmed, and Hurricane Katrina is an excellent example of that. Can we construct a valid resilience index? And we can if we develop a strong theoretical foundation and have empirical evidence to support it, as opposed to what I see as people just picking indicators out of the air, or I'll explain yet another tactic that I think is misguided for compiling these indices. So here's an overview of my presentation today. I'm going to define economic resilience, illustrate an operational metric, talk about the theoretical foundation for analysis and measurement. That's primarily in the Journal of Regional Science paper. Integrate the foundation into an operational model. That's the second part of that JRS paper. Calibrate the model and apply it. I guess that's still part of the second. And extend the foundation to a resilience index, which gets us to the second paper. So let me begin by defining economic resilience. So I divide it in a couple of different ways. One is the difference between static and dynamic economic resilience. So the general definition of resilience, if you take all the peripheral terms out and get to the essence, is the ability of a system to maintain function after it's been shocked. And this is very much consistent with the economic definition of, that I put forward of using or making efficient use of the remaining resources at a given point in time. And I'll give you some examples in a moment. And I further make the cut and distinction between inherent resilience, resilience that's already there, part of our system, and adaptive resilience, which involves ingenuity, improvisation, technological advance, where necessity is the mother of invention, which people have found really comes to the fore in the aftermath of a disaster. So inherent resilience examples are having backup generators when the power goes out, substituting critical inputs, shifting operations to branch plants, and adaptive resilience would be technological change or draconian conservation. So more conservation than you thought was possible. And so give you an example of how resilience can be enhanced ahead of time. Well, you buy the backup generator, but you don't use it until you need it. And in terms of adaptive resilience, the difference between ordinary conservation and draconian is again, conservation you didn't think was humanly possible, but an example of how it can be eroded is, yes, you might be able to run your factory without air conditioning for a couple of days, but if you try to do that for a couple of months, your workers are likely to rebel. So some of these resilience tactics increase in their capabilities over time, for instance, the ability to substitute technological change, and some of them decline, like the use of inventories that are finite and draconian conservation. There's also dynamic economic resilience that I'm not going to spend very much time on today. This refers to the ability and speed of a system to recover. So rearranging the resources that you have will not get you to recovery. It will help you keep operating, but you really have to invest in repair and reconstruction to recover. And investment in economics is a dynamic phenomenon because it's time related. It's the act of setting aside resources potentially used for current consumption to improve your productivity at a later date. So another thing to emphasize is that resilience is operative at three levels: the individual business, utility or household, and for instance, for the business on the supplier side, examples would be system redundancy, and those are very expensive. Supply side resilience tends again to be structural, tends to be things like having an alternate pipeline that just lays there while it's not being used, and various expensive options. The customer side resilience, which I've kind of pioneered, is they're much more prevalent in terms of the options, much less costly. And in addition to the examples I had before, things like the use of inventories. Resilience is also applicable not just at the micro level, but what we might call the meso level for the individual market or sector. And one of the things that's often misunderstood is the role of markets and prices as a source of resilience. So after a disaster, you often see price increases. Well, everybody points fingers and says, well, this is gouging. And some of it is, but some of it's warranted, because what happens during and after a disaster is you've got fewer resources. So scarcity is a main driver of prices, And higher prices reflect higher value, and when things are more scarce, they have more value. So price increases are like pain to the body. They hurt, but they give us an indication that something's wrong, and they let us rearrange our economic decision making in the right direction. And then we have the macro level aspects of resilience, countervailing policies that go all the way up to the Federal Reserve Bank and the President in terms of fiscal and monetary policy, and then things relating to regional economies. If we can't produce certain critical inputs, at least we can import them. Now, another thing to emphasize is bottom line here in terms of what we're trying to do with resilience is reduce business interruption. And we're trying to do this business interruption after the event. So that may strike people as strange, and it's really caused a paradigm shift in what used to be called hazard loss estimation, impact analysis, and now called economic consequence analysis. So people in regional science and economics have understood this, but the field was dominated up till the mid-1990s by engineers. And so the acknowledgement was that we can't prevent all disasters, or it's too costly to do so, but we can reduce some losses after the disaster strikes. So what we're getting at here is infrastructure or factories aren't important in their own right in terms of their property value. It's the services that they provide, the goods and services that they generate that affect our well-being. And so we need to make a fundamental distinction. You see in economics the difference between stocks and flows. And stocks are things like assets, and so there the focus would be on property damage, and that takes place at the point of the disaster. And to me, that's what engineers do. That's not very interesting to an economist. What's interesting is the flows, that lost business, the business interruption, which begins immediately at the point of the disaster. They used to call these indirect effects, and I've made the case for years that these are really direct. I mean, they just happen instantaneously as well, and continues until the economy is recovered. And so that can be 2 weeks or a couple of years. So an interesting realization, and until a couple of years ago, whenever you saw something in the newspaper that talked about a disaster, well, they'd say, well, the disaster caused $20 billion worth of damage, and it was all property damage. Now you'll see even newspapers mention GDP or lost revenues or lost economic activity. And so what we've also been able to show is that the business interruption is as large in magnitude as is property damage. So I had the honor a couple of years ago of coordinating 8 studies to come up with a definitive estimate of the economic impacts of 9/11. And we found the consensus estimate was that the business interruption losses were 4 times greater than the value of the World Trade Center itself. Hurricane Katrina, the property damage is estimated to be about $75 billion, the largest in terms of physical damage. Well, business interruption has now exceeded that. And the reason is we still haven't recovered from Katrina. So it gets into some tricky things about what recovery means and whether you have to recover to the old level, which is now referred to as recovering to the new normal. But it's really not clear that New Orleans has done that. So finally, business interruption is getting attention, and as I said at the outset, what we're talking about is reducing business interruption. So we're making a distinction between mitigation, which is or things you do before the event, and resilience, which are things you implement afterwards. You can improve resilience capacity before, but you don't implement it until afterwards. And most of the attention has been on mitigation, and one of my major points has been we need to strike a better balance between the two. Also in the profession, you see a bifurcation of opinions. There's some people who think resilience should cover everything, including mitigation. And those that think, well, we've got a perfectly good word for what we do before the event. What we need is a good word for all the things we do afterwards, and we should relegate resilience to that. So not surprisingly, the engineering community didn't want to they wanted to get on the bandwagon, and so cloak themselves in the resilience buzzword, and so they're the ones that typically define it quite broadly. So here's an example of the resilience metric applied to 9/11. So it turned out that there were 1,100 businesses and government agencies operating in the World Trade Center before 9/11. Now, if all of those firms would have gone out of business, the direct business interruption loss would have been $58 billion for the first year of their activity. If all the relocation were immediate, essentially the business interruption would have been zero. But there was some business interruptions because firms...
Adam, are those in the World Trade Center, or is it some larger...
Oh, well, I'm sorry, World Trade Center area. So I would say 90% were in the World Trade Center, and there was some in the area that was damaged or cordoned off and couldn't operate. But relocation is not instantaneous, and most firms relocated within 2 to 3 months, but some it took up to 8 months. So there was a business interruption loss. And so my simple metric, which I offered 10 years ago in a paper, in a lesser journal, was, well, here's a metric of resilience. It's kind of simple, but it's straightforward. It can be measured. Challenge the profession to come up with something better. And so the metric is the avoided losses divided by the maximum potential loss. So it's what portion of the maximum potential losses can you reduce by applying resilience. And so this is only one of several tactics, and so the calculation is 58.4 minus 16.1 is the avoided losses divided by the maximum potential. And so relocation had a resilience measure of 72%. It was able to avoid 72% of the potential direct economic losses from 9/11. And we've, extend that with the type of model I'll show you in a minute to cover indirect losses too. So there are indirect losses, but they're multiplier, general equilibrium effects, as an economist would specify. Yes.
In that number, did you make an assumption about, I'm assuming you're going off revenues, right, that were filed for these companies? Or how do you get to that 16.1 billion?
Well, we had to do it indirectly. We interviewed businesses. We got a lot of the basic data from a study that was done after 9/11, but what that study omitted, for instance, it indicated 95% of the firms relocated. But we interviewed firms and asked them how long it took to relocate, whether their relocation was kind of incremental or no business and then started up, and so we did an estimate. We didn't think the businesses would give us their revenue numbers, so we took their employment numbers and translated them into revenues, which is a standard practice in impact analysis.
Because one thing I'm thinking about also is the informal businesses, right, that don't get caught in that. So granted, in the greater scheme of billions, they're zero, but if you talk about kind of multipliers, all the people selling T-shirts and doing and stuff, you go around the World Trade Center side, there's
Right.
So them going down to zero actually has a fairly large multiplier effect if there's.
Well, yeah, no. Let me say two things. Most of the firms that did go out of business were small. They tend to be, let's say, a mom and pop restaurant, older couple that just decided to, move to Florida. That was enough, or the T-shirt salesman, etc. But while just to give you an idea, 95% of the businesses relocated, but they were 98% of the employment. So yes, there were the T-shirt guys and all, but they're such a small percentage of the direct activity. And the indirect activity, a lot of those T-shirts are made in China, so it leaks out of the economy. It's not a multiplier effect that affects the U.S. economy. But we can talk about that later on. That's a diagram which might come up, be useful later on. So what I wanted to talk about next is a modeling approach that I use, which is a comprehensive approach to modeling an economy, either at the regional or national level. It's the state-of-the-art tool for policy and simulation when we talk about the the macro level. And so here's kind of I've tried to take the jargon out, but the important terms is we're talking about the entire economy, and we're talking about a model from the ground up. It's based on decisions by individual producers and consumers, and it explicitly factors in the role of prices and markets, which is important for reasons we talked about here. Explicitly includes constraints in terms of the availability of capital, labor, and natural resources, and not only what they were before the event, but the lower quantity of all of those when the disaster hits. So many of you may not be familiar with this. You're more likely to be familiar with input-output analysis, which is a very versatile tool, very inexpensive, easy to use. And one can think of CGE in two ways. It essentially treats the economy as a set of integrated supply chains, focuses on interdependence, full accounting of all inputs, and so it captures the best features of input-output analysis, but it overcomes the limitations. It's nonlinear, it has behavioral content, it has an explicit role for prices and markets, and it embodies constraints, it incorporates constraints. And so it's ideal for economic consequence analysis because it will trace through micro decisions up through markets, up through the entire economy, and give you a bottom line result as to what the impact of whatever you're simulating is on things like GDP, employment, revenues, taxes, etc. This is kind of a circular flow diagram, which I think you've seen in elementary econ courses. Businesses produce goods, they essentially sell them in markets and get revenues. Households consume those goods, and they consume them because they offer their labor and capital in factor markets and receive income, and businesses have to pay them. So this inner core is the standard characterization of an economy. What CGE does, and IO does as well, is looks at business-to-business interactions, the production of intermediate goods and services. Raw steel, chemicals, electric power for business. And so that is explicitly incorporated. And also provides more detail than, let's say, most econometric models with regard to households and their activities, including non-market activities that might be very important in the context of a disaster where there's a boil water decree or other changes to household activity, and so you can treat the household as a producing unit where the household buys raw food, uses electricity, and uses its labor to produce prepared meals, for example. And you can see how the opportunity cost of time of having to boil water or going a roundabout way to perform that activity does, in fact, have a cost. These are some of the strengths of CGE modeling, and I'm not going to go over all of them. Some of the important ones is that the production functions tend to be inclusive of all inputs, not just primary factors of production. I mentioned some of these before. You can look at the distributional impacts. I've done this in much of my work, looking at who gains and who loses, what the equity or income distribution impacts are, and you can incorporate engineering and simulation data readily into these models. And that's pretty important because econometrics has a lot of strengths. It's much more statistically sound. You have goodness of fit measures, but you need a large set of data, often preferably time series. So helps to have experience. Well, we don't have that much experience with disasters. So it's one of the reasons we can't use econometric analysis as much as we would like to. So this is just an overview of the CGE model. I showed you the diagram, pretty much does it. But here's the core of CGE modeling. And that's production theory. So a production function characterizes how inputs are transformed into outputs, how we use various types of inputs in combination. And so here's a sort of a general implicit, what we call production function function of capital and labor, primary factors of production. We also distinguish, we can include intermediate goods, and it's typical to distinguish energy and materials, and also if you're talking about water disruptions, distinguish water as well. And I guess before I say this, production theory is kind of the heart of microeconomics. It's especially well developed. It can be very sophisticated. If you're serious about doing work in economics, I strongly would encourage everyone who wants to do that to go beyond what Price has to offer in terms of 501A and 501B. You really have to take a course, a graduate course in the econ department if you really want to do serious work. I used to be chair of applied econ departments, and I'd always have my students take the core theory, PhD core theory. PhD students take PhD core theory in econ. And even when I moved over to the geography department, I would at least have them take PhD micro at Penn State. So one example of a production function is something called the constant elasticity of substitution version. And the beauty of this is that you may be familiar with something called the Cobb-Douglas production function. It's the most basic version. And the problem with the Cobb-Douglas production function is it requires pretty much that the elasticity of substitution between any two inputs be exactly equal to 1. And that's a very restrictive consideration that gives you some pretty high levels of substitution in a disaster, especially short run. In our one of the early papers we did, we looked at something like a 40% reduction in electricity availability in a major earthquake, and the impact without any resilience other than this price substitution was that the impact on the economy was only a 2% loss of GDP and employment, and that's because the model was able to substitute everything for everything else that was in short supply very fastly without much price increase, and we realized that's not going to work. So we've gone to the CES, and it allows for a range of substitution possibilities, very low or inelastic ones referring to necessities, or very short run considerations where it's not easy to substitute. And a nesting version of this, and I'll show you an example in a minute, which allows, if you don't do this, then if you have 4 inputs, then the elasticity of substitution can be something other than 1, but it has to be the exact same thing for all the pairs. And so this enables you to have that elasticity different between various pairs. And resilience tactics, first pass, are embodied in the parameters and functional relationships of this production function. So in economics anyway, there is a strong emphasis on theoretical grounding and not some ad hoc listing of resilience tactics and how they work, but grounding it in production theory really got people's attention and helped establish this work. So here's an example of CGE model nesting for this type of production function, which we often refer to as a CLEM production function. And this one doesn't include water. I can show you how water would be inserted in a moment, but it's one that focuses a little more on energy and getting down to the nitty-gritty on energy. So essentially what you do is you take, in each of these nests or levels, you take different combinations of inputs to produce some aggregate of them. So there are various kinds of fuels, oil, gas, and coal, and those are combined with electricity in an energy aggregate. And there's some substitution between these in aggregate, some substitution between the oil, gas, and coal, which we haven't shown explicitly but is in here. Then the energy input is combined with the capital input for capital energy aggregate. It's combined with labor for this. You have similar combinations for materials, and then you have this combination here. So they all come up in pairs, but the point is that you can have reasonably high substitution elasticities between gas and coal if you've got a dual-fired boiler here, and in the short run still have very low elasticity of substitution between capital and energy here, and those elasticities can differ. But it also helps you get a picture and some good insight into how the decisions are made in production in terms of a hierarchical decision process with respect to inputs and producing outputs. This is the functional form for a constant elasticity substitution production function, the various nests. The elasticity of substitution is usually given by this lowercase sigma and equal to a certain combination of the exponents. It's somewhat complex. I don't know if have you seen a CES production function in the price school? Okay, good. All right. So this is the kind of production function we used, and the next point is if you're going to apply this production function to a disaster, you need to distinguish resilient behavior and ordinary behavior. And production functions are normally estimated with under normal conditions, non-disaster conditions. So you have to recalibrate them for stressful conditions. And we can use survey or simulation data for disaster aftermath. I used survey data from the Northridge earthquake in the JRS paper that Kathleen Tierney, the head of the Disaster Research Center, had collected. And the standard approach to solving a production function for an individual sector is you solve for outputs given inputs and parameters. And what we're trying to do is recalibrate this so we have the input and output data from the survey or simulation where those are given, and we wind up solving for the parameters or the parameter changes. And that's what most of the core of that paper is in terms we worked out some optimization algorithms to do that, a lot of equations, the cost minimizing production function, and this traces through to where we were able to do this sort of analytically for conservation, which basically calls for the change in the these are shares, but basically it's change in A, the change in a scaling coefficient, where if that increases if you're able to use fewer inputs per unit of output, which denotes conservation. So we're able to solve that analytically. The elasticity of substitution parameter, and you'd expect substitution to be less in the very short run than it is in the typical long run. Specification and estimation of these functions, we had to use numerical methods to come up with numerical estimates of changes in elasticity of substitution. And so it's more of a diagram which shows all the changes and the decomposition of those changes and how we basically started out our conservation. This basically is a roadmap of what resilience tactics can be analyzed in a production function and what can't. So conservation of water, it's this term that you have to recalibrate. Conservation of other inputs, it would be the A parameters and other nests. Increased substitutability of other inputs for water, it would be the substitution in the first nest. Backup supplies, inventories, you can treat like conservation. Time of day use of water or electricity, that's a little tricky, and you'd have to sort of do a side calculation. Change in technology would affect many of the parameters, but you could use methods similar to the ones that we presented. This is some of the results, but I think the results that are a little more interesting are sort of a follow-up paper and published in Risk Analysis and one in edited volume by our colleagues Jim Moore, Harry Richardson, and Peter Gordon, where we looked at a 2-week outage in Los Angeles and the potential to avoid business interruption losses through these various kinds of resilience tactics. So, for instance, you really can't store electricity very well, so that's minimal. Alternative sources of water. At this point, we weren't really cued into how much groundwater storage there really was, so we set that equal to 0. The biggest factors that, in this case, of a, let's say, terrorist attack on the water power system was production rescheduling, biggest source of resilience. So what are we saying there? We're saying that terrorist attack, unlike an earthquake, which might damage the factories, doesn't. It just targets the electric power system. There was finally a revelation that somebody tried this in the Silicon Valley not too long ago, almost successfully. So if you're out, electricity's off for 2 weeks, what prevents you from, when the electricity comes back on, from just starting up your production lines and recapturing the lost production? And your factory's not damaged, so the probabilities or possibilities are pretty high, potentially. Your customers are not going to abandon you if you're out of business and can't deliver your inputs for 2 weeks. They either have inventories or they'll wait or their electricity's off. But once the electricity's back on, you work extra shifts or overtime, and the cost is pretty minimal of recouping all of that lost production. Anybody familiar with HASIS?
With what?
HASIS, it's FEMA's loss estimation software. So Stephanie Chang, who's a planner at UBC, and I put the recapture factors, production rescheduling, into HASIS many years ago. And we also, this is what we're sort of just, before we had a sort of framework and all, put some of the other considerations like inventories in there. This is an example of a port disruption. I'm a little short on time, so let me go to the second part quickly. And so there's been this move to identify and compile aspects of resilience, and the purpose is to gauge the current status, how resilient are we, and to make progress. A lot of this comes under the heading of community resilience. And it's got many notable flaws. I think the main one is that a woman named Susan Cutter, who's former president of the American Association of Geographers and a leader in hazards research, came up with a vulnerability index in the early 2000s. Excellent piece of work, published in Social Science Quarterly. And very well done. But a lot of people said, well, isn't resilience just the opposite or the flip side of vulnerability? And the answer is no, especially not in economics. The vulnerability has a lot of background conditions like literacy rates, like the unemployment rate, like the percent minority or physically challenged. And in economics, if you're talking about businesses getting back on their feet, those are not actionable variables to get a business back on its feet. And so my work is to establish a theoretical grounding and to look at what I think are a more preferred set of resilience indicators. In this paper, we did a survey. These are only about half the papers we analyzed as to what their approach was, what the problems were inherent in their compilation of resilience indicators, and then set forth a roadmap for developing them. So a critique of existing indicators are, as I mentioned before, simply adapting vulnerability indicators. They lack a theoretical base, lack evidence, lack attention in the short run, lack attention to business markets and workings of the economy. They tend to be a lot of community-oriented things with kind of this being missing, and a lack of actionable variables. And so using production theory again, this is in this paper. And what I've identified is which of the factors of production are affected and whether it's inherent or adaptive resilience. So that's key here. So if it's a capital, then it means it's has sort of a strong role. If it's lowercase, then it's a lesser role. And so this is the basis, as I've done in the study, for including more considerations than we've formally modeled so far into the analysis. And going from this, some guidelines for indicator choice. We want it to have, you want it not just pull these out of the air, but have a strong theoretical and evidentiary basis. The actionable variables, another big criticism I have of the literature is a lot of people throw in 15 indicators and they'll give them all equal weight. Well, you know, they shouldn't all have equal weight. How do you weight them? Well, you go back to that diagram where I showed how effective they were, and that is a way that you can weight them. So here's more explicit steps, and last slide, then it's sort of a conclusion. So I've focused a lot on methodology, but I want to leave you to a little more with sort of some big picture issues. So I haven't talked a lot about mitigation. When I have, I've kind of been critical. So this isn't meant to say mitigation is not important, because it's still really key, especially when we talk, you know, you can make up lost production, but you can't make up lives. So mitigation that's life-saving is very, very important. And all the stuff I said about resilience after the fact can save some lives in terms of those people injured and getting in the hospital and having the medicine available for them and all. But mitigation is more of a life-saving. And then there's also some aspects of irreversibilities with respect to unique ecosystems as well. But resilience is a worthy second line of defense. It's effective, it's low cost, conservation more than pays for itself, relocation is inexpensive, production rescheduling takes very little. Plus, you don't have to use them, implement them, until you know the disaster's taken place. The mitigation, you build the dam, the seawall, whatever, and the disaster may never come, but you've invested all of that. Resilience applies to producers and consumers, and much of my work has been on the consumer side, both business consumers and household consumers, and how they make decisions that are resilient. And so all told, then, we're all consumers. We may not all own factories, but resilience is a way we can all contribute to reducing losses from disasters. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
I was wondering whether the role of government failure or government action in a disaster is implicitly tied up in some of either the elasticities or other inputs into this model, or if they're just effectively
excellent question in two ways. So I must admit, when I talked about resilience and its effectiveness, 9/11, we had an actual event in which we measured resilience. We've had one other. Most of the others have been simulation cases. So when I talk about production rescheduling, then I'm talking about kind of an idealized situation, but there could be government failure that interferes with business operations for whatever reason. Or when we get to the dynamic definition of resilience, and we talk about reducing recovery, or the time of recovery. So obviously, if it takes you twice as long to recover, you're likely to incur twice as much business interruption if you have to wait and produce zero and then come up. So failure can be very important there in terms of a lot of red tape and paperwork in getting a small business loan, and various other dispensations of aid. So those are some examples, both in static and dynamic resilience.
Or even just sort of from a pure kind of capture or corruption effect. Like, you look at Louisiana, right? What just happened with Megan and his convictions compared, and
Right.
how that wraps up into what happened with the recovery in Louisiana compared to the recovery from Sandy.
Not to mention New Jersey.
Right. So, yeah.
Potentially too. So yeah, there is. That would be a fertile area of research. I'm not so much a governance guy, even though I do have an NSF proposal in now that where we are looking at dynamic resilience, and some of those government considerations are a small portion of that might affect investment decisions.
Let's go Ryan and then Vince.
Actually, I have two quick ones. You reference information clearinghouses
Right.
as sort of meso-level dynamic adaptive strategy. And I was hoping you might give us a real-world example of one of those in one of these various contexts you've studied, just so we have a firmer grasp of how that functions, or even maybe the role of government in assisting that in various contexts. And then the second, just again to ground a little bit on your excellent slide of sort of the proposed indicators that would comprise the index that you're proposing. Because you referenced production rescheduling and how that's now, that finding was so significant, it's been reincorporated into HAZUS? Or is
Right, well, I mean, that,
to some level?
no, it has been many years ago, yeah.
Okay, and so I guess what I'm asking is, which of the ideas, which of those sub-indicators of the index do you think holds the biggest promise for the next incorporation into some of these larger models being used by FEMA?
Okay. So the first question about an information clearinghouse is, what I'm referring to there is in a disaster, some suppliers have lost their customers for a given product, and some customers have lost their product, their suppliers. Some customers lost their suppliers for the same product. And so in the chaos that can ensue, it would help to have some mechanism to match these people up, because there are goods sitting there that can't be delivered to one entity that could to another. So an information clearinghouse could facilitate that and improve the market actions. So there has been a move afoot for several years, and I've always meant to pursue it, but I was told by the former head of Los Angeles Emergency Management that there was serious talk about establishing those. And if you go to the Los Angeles Emergency Management Office, there's like the emergency, what's it called, center, where there are various representatives of the community as well as emergency management, and there are some major businesses that have a seat at that table or a seat in the room, and they can communicate with each other. Now, that's sort of the government market strengthening, but what you also find is that industry is getting more aware, and what they're doing is broadening the supply chain. So in the past, there was this tendency to, well, we've got a preferred supplier, let's just work with them. And now firms are realizing that their confirmed supplier may not be operating, and so they've gone to have negotiations with backup suppliers. So in other words, what the market is starting to do that. And what we find in many of these cases is that, just like nature abhors a vacuum, so does the market. So what we found that will promote resilience is a business continuity industry. And this is something I've wanted to study for a couple of years. The formation of this industry, new firms and outfits like ServPro that are starting to market their capabilities after a disaster. In other words, if you're a business, it's like you're probably too young to remember the Maytag repairman commercials where he was the loneliest guy in the world because Maytag washing machines were so good they never needed repair. Well, if you're in the disaster cleanup business and only the disaster cleanup business, well, you twiddle your thumbs for years. So what you almost need to do is have a day job, so to speak. But there's an increased number of that. As far as which to include in HAZUS, it's not that we haven't realized what should be included. It's the difficulty of including them in a simple software. And if you've worked with HAZUS's problem is, it had to dumb things down to make it so easy to use and widely accessible. And it turns out that the parameter changes we put in there just never got fully tested And the model is far too flexible with respect to small parameter changes. So we need to shore some aspects of HAZUS up before. And so the limitation is not our knowledge about what's the most effective. And rescheduling probably is, and that's actually a very easy one. But how to model it.
Vincent?
So my question is about kind of, I guess, cost on three fronts, and how the model kind of fully captures it. So one, somewhat related to Matt, is kind of the opportunity cost of government resources, right? In this, there's government, huge subsidies in regards to tax breaks, but also direct grants that kind of go into promoting this resilience, right? So there's a true cost and opportunity cost there of those resources. The second is kind of on the firm level of kind of redistributing their resources, so they have lost revenue, but they also have the lost opportunity costs associated with kind of attributing those resources towards towards increasing growth instead of kind of getting back to where they were. And then I guess the third is on the kind of human capital level, particularly as it relates to kind of 9/11, and when you think of, these are real lives lost, so aside from, as you say, the psychological and personal impact that has on the families, but even more so, or just as easily, it's a part of the productive labor force, a very highly skilled, highly educated, in the case of 9/11, part of the production, part of the labor force that, sure, you can look at kind of from a revenue standpoint, but you're losing a lot of kind of social and human capital in that kind of, particularly for firms like Cantor Fitzgerald, who lost, and so I guess this kind of a three-layered thing is, as you kind of push these models, how do you think of the opportunity costs and the lost value of those of those resources?
So let me take those one at a time. The first one was sort of government resources. And the thing about government resources, and I'll always sound like an economist, even though regional science has been very, very good to me in terms of broadening my horizons over the years. The government payments are not a resource loss, they're a transfer payment. And so you have to keep that in mind, that distinction. A cost in benefit cost analysis is using up of a resource, and giving somebody a loan or outright aid payment is really a transfer from one entity to another, not necessarily a real resource cost. But it is a problem. Well, yeah, there may be an opportunity cost in the sense that money might be better used elsewhere. Okay, but you'd be hard pressed to say it'd be better what's the more likely use, helping somebody get back on their feet after a disaster or some average government spending. Now, that being said, the other problem with government payouts is the moral hazard problem. And so, but it's a separate issue, and what we're getting at is that people are getting sick of the government bailing people out who have been making poor decisions repeatedly with these transfers. In other words, people live in a floodplain, the flood comes, the government will reimburse them for some or all of the damage, and then they'll go rebuild in the floodplain. And that's a moral hazard issue. So that some of the most effective mitigation grants, and I headed up a congressional study about 12 years ago, published 10 years ago, to evaluate FEMA hazard mitigation grants over a 10-year period, and the most cost-effective were buying homes out in the floodplain so that you didn't have the repetitive flooding. So that's the response on the government side. You look like you had a
Well, I guess the counterfactual, right, isn't if I had given this person after the event assistance or not. The counterfactual is that if this event never happened and the government could use those resources towards an alternative purpose, right?
Yeah.
So if not, I guess that's the true cost of it is the counterfactual of the event never happening.
I see, but you can't really blame that on the government. It's that what's really the loss is the loss of that building or the business interruption, not the government payment. And let me just say, if you know about the New Zealand earthquake, essentially what they're doing is reimbursing people, helping them get back on their feet, but zoning them out of dangerous areas in the future. So people are learning. With respect to some other things, I didn't mean to demean the human capital loss. That can be measured as best economists and others can, and I think that's important, and this work could benefit from a broader and a better perspective.